Hello and welcome to our February 2015 Hangout. This is take 2. I originally recorded the presentation on February 27th, but the audio in the recording did not come through, so we're trying this again. And on our February 2015 Hangout, we're going to cover user management and privileges. So I'm going to add a little bit of info in here based on the user questions I had at the end and a couple of things that have come out since, but should be roughly the same as it was when we did it live. All right, first up, some project notes. We have pfSense 2.2.1 coming in the near future, and it addresses some problems we found in 2.2 release and after. That actually, the release build is being tested right now, which is on today is Friday, March 13th. So we should have that out hopefully very early next week. We have our pfSense University online training. Several classes are complete. We're getting good feedback. We still have some more classes we're adding, so there's still openings and more classes coming. So if you haven't been able to get in one, keep trying. We'll have some more seats ready. And Jim Thompson posted a roadmap for future versions of pfSense. Just very briefly, for our 2.3 version, we're going to move away from PBIs and over to package.ng because that's where everyone's moving, and it's really matured. It's really strong. We are deprecating PPTP. It will be completely removed from our system. It's just a security nightmare, and I know a lot of people are really stuck to it, but it's past time to move on. It's really dangerous to keep that around from a security standpoint anymore. We're going to be changing our update mechanism. We're aiming for something based on package or package.ng, or failing that, maybe something like FreeBSD update style thing. The build system is going to get an overhaul, and we're looking into a bootstrap GUI. We're putting some effort toward that. There's already a project out there to convert the GUI over, but we're putting some resources toward that as well. A little bit further down the line, we're looking at our 3.0 version. We're going to be completely removing the PHP code. We're moving over to Python, adding a REST API. In the API, there's talk of eventually porting that back to 2.3. The core is going to be using Intel DPDK for pretty much processing packets and things at the NIC level, and encryption enhancements and so on. So it's going to be able to push quite a lot of traffic on very moderate hardware, so that'll be good. We've also got some new hardware coming soon. It's just about released. Hopefully we're going to start shipping these things here in the next week or two, and those are all, I'm going to cover those here in a minute. The hardware we've got, it's Intel C2000 family, Rangeley type systems. Where the first ones to come out are mini ITX form factor. We have a smaller nano ITX box and a rack mount version that should be coming around June. The first two, the mini ITX, are more of a desktop style case, but that you could put them on a shelf in a rack or something if you had to. The first two we're coming out with are the SG2440 and the SG4860. And then in May, June, we're going to have an 8860, which is a bigger version, which will be the rack mount one, and a 2220, which is smaller. It'll be close to the size of an APU or ALIX. And in those model numbers, you can easily tell from the model numbers. The first number is the number of cores. The second number is how much RAM it has in gigabytes. And the third number is the number of network ports. So 2440 is 2 cores, 4 gig of RAM, 4 network ports. The 4860 is 4 cores, 8 gig of RAM, 6 network ports, and so on. And all of these have AES-NI and Quick Assist, so there's extremely fast VPN handling. That at the moment, the only thing that's really accelerated is the AES GCM with IPsec. Eventually, OpenVPN is going to be gaining that as well, but it has to get into OpenVPN upstream first and then come down through us. But we're working on expanding that. And the first two systems are linked on the store, and you can see that already. The 2440 is going to be $499. The 4860 is going to be $699. The 2440 is more of a replacement for what we used to have, the 7551. The 4860 is a little bit of a step up from that. At the moment, it's somewhere between what the 7551 and the C2758 was. or is rather. We're going to still carry the 2758 for the foreseeable future. And these guys also, you can almost tell from the picture, they have a USB console, which actually is like a built-in USB serial console. So a little bit, you don't have to worry about lugging around a serial cable to get to the console on these guys. It'll be really handy. All right. One more thing on the project notes. Another thing that was added after this, there is now a proxy for FTP on 2.2. It's just called FTP client proxy, and you can just load that. It's just a regular package. Just go to System and Packages. You can install the proxy package, and then activate it. It only works for clients, so you'd activate it like on your LAN interface. And then it will proxy out, active FTP and allow the connections to come back through. For passive FTP, it will let you still work with a restrictive LAN side rule set to get out. It does not work with encrypted FTP, but there's bypass boxes, so you can set up a bypass list for servers that are encrypted FTP that need to get around the proxy. Now, if you're like load balancing and multi-WAN, there is a quirk with that, but with the proxy in place, using active mode FTP from the client should work fine with load balancing WANs. All right, so now that we're past all that, just on to what we're going to be covering today. And we're going to be covering user management and privileges, and both the why and the how you would want to use additional accounts. So not just going through the technical aspect of how to do it, but also going to be covering a little bit of the theory and security aspects. GUI and SSH user security and GUI and SSH network security, and some other concerns. And I was hoping to have some time to cover LDAP. That's not going to be in this one. I'll get to that in a future hangout. I'll have a one where we do remote users thing along that line. Okay, first, so why would you want to use multiple users? There's lots of good reasons, but the big ones are number one, security. It keeps the number of people with the root and admin password low. You really do not want that many people, if anybody, to have that. And some security specifications say you can't use that account because it's a default account. So you can't delete the admin account, but you can disable it. So you could, after you create all of your other admin accounts, you can go in and disable the admin account if you're on a standalone system. CARP does still need to use the admin user for synchronization, but that's a special case. Also, if somebody leaves or if they only need temporary access with a separate account, it's a lot easier to lock them out. You don't have to worry about changing their root password all the time if somebody leaves. Then you just disable their own personal account, and then that's it. You can either delete it or disable, depending on if they're going to be coming back or if they're gone for good. User access can be limited to specific pages that they need to see. So when you're working with privileges, you can set it so they can only visit certain pages. And users can be denied config write privileges so that they can look but they can't touch, so to speak. Now, another reason is accountability. When they make a change, it shows in the logs and the config history and who made the change and what IP address they came from. If you're all using the same account, you might get a different IP address, but say you have three people managing the firewall remotely, they all come from the same place. You would never know who made a change if they were all using the admin account. They'd all just be pointing the fingers at each other. But with separate accounts, they can't do that. It's every change they make, it's tagged with their name. So if something happens, you know exactly who did it. So you know who to praise or you know who to punish. Now, the firewall and NAT rules are also tagged with the creator and the last person to change. So if we go like over here to firewall and rules, and we look at just one of these guys here, this was automatically created by port forward. But if we go to like this rule up here, was created and updated at the same time by the admin account at that particular IP address. And so if a user makes a change, like if I save this and go back and edit it, you can see now that I'm logged in as Alice, the admin, and I was able to update that just now. Also for non-administrative access, things like OpenVPN remote access, VPNs, IPsec remote access, captive portal accounts, people doing file transfers to the firewall, that sort of stuff. You can have accounts that do not get access to GUI pages, which is a good thing. All right, a few notes about our privilege system in pfSense. Privileges can be set on per user, or they can be inherited from a group. Groups are a lot easier to work with, and so I'm going to focus very heavily on using groups. There are privileges for just about every page in the GUI, and then we have some special privileges that aren't page-based necessarily. There's like for a special page like the dashboard, it also includes some things that are needed to be pulled in to let the dashboard function. There is a special privilege just for captive portal access, but it's optional in the portal settings. There's a choice that you can either require that or not. There's a special permission for IPsec XAuth VPN dial-in access. There's also one for L2TP and PPPoE dial-in access, and there's PPTP as well, but since we're doing away with that, I'm not going to touch that. We have SSH tunnel only access, we have SCP access and SSH shell access, which we have more coverage of that here later in the Hangout, so I'll get into more details there. There's a privilege just for the help pages, and there's the deny configuration right privilege, which will, if they try to save something to the configuration, it just does nothing. And there's also a special user password manager page, which allows them just access to a page to change their password, which is handy for captive portal users. I'll get to that one in a bit too. Now, just to note that most packages do not hook in or they're not compatible with privileges. In some cases, they do, but most don't. If they do, when you go in and look at the privilege list, you'll see them in the list. If there's nothing there, odds are they don't. Some of them don't even require authentication. For example, like LightSquid for looking at reports. If they can reach the GUI port, and they know the path to LightSquid, they can get in. They don't even need a password. So it's something to be very wary of when you're working with packages. All right, so just a couple more notes before I actually get to the how to do this. Using groups vastly speeds up and simplifies the process of managing privileges. You can make a group, add some permissions to the group, and then just add people into that group. That way, if somebody else needs the same permissions, you don't have to go and remember all those privileges or hunt them down or track them down. It's just a lot easier to use groups. When you're editing or when you're creating a user or group, you have to save it first and then go back and edit it to add permissions. You can't actually add the permissions when you're creating it. Just an extra step involved there. You do need to be wary of the permission order. When a user tries to log in, it will send them to the dashboard, but if they don't have dashboard access, they'll get sent to whatever the next page is that's listed in their permissions. So say OpenVPN status is the first thing that they've got in their permission list, but not dashboard access. They hit the dashboard, they'll get automatically redirected over to OpenVPN status. So whichever page you want them to hit, you need to make sure your permissions are ordered so that that's at the top of the list. And don't blindly add the do not deny config right privilege to the all or admins group. We've had a couple of people accidentally go in and they just basically hit edit and then selected everything in the list and saved, which is a bad thing. You just really don't want to do that because you don't want to deny config right to your admin user or you get into a bad place. Another note is when you're working with privileges, if you do set specific privileges for a user, then the menus change to only show them the pages they can actually reach, which is handy. They won't see menu options they have no rights to. And then if they try to reach one of those pages anyway, say they know what the URL is, if they go to that, it will stop and redirect them back to a page they do have access to. A couple more gotchas or working with it. You need to be careful of pages that can execute commands or apply changes. If they have denied config right on their user privileges, it does not stop them from pressing the apply changes button. It doesn't stop them from running commands on the exec page. So say you give somebody access to diagnostics command. If they have denied config right, they can effectively get around that. They can modify the system in other ways, or they could even, in theory, modify the configuration through that page to do whatever they need. Same thing with like the backup restore. You can kind of get into the same bind there. Somebody could back up a configuration, manually edit it, upload it, and end up right back in the firewall, doing whatever they want. So you need to control access to that page. The config history, they could still restore an older configuration, but since they can't do it an arbitrary configuration, it's not quite as bad, but it's still not desirable. So you need control access to that one as well. When you grant users SSH access, they don't get to the menu because they don't have the rights to those commands. A lot of the commands that are run from that menu need admin or root, and if you try to use them with a plain user, they just can't do it. You can use the Sudo package to delegate privileges so they can do that. We'll cover that later. And even if they can't make changes to files or run certain commands, they still can see things in certain places. So you need to be wary of file permissions and things in the command line. So if there's sensitive info in any of those passwords, things like that, if there's something you don't want them to see, don't give them shell access. All right. Well, first up is group management. And as I've been saying, groups are by far the easiest way to manage user privileges. And we get to those here under System User Manager on the Groups tab. Now, when we're here, we can just click plus to create a new group, and you just fill in the group name and description, and you can optionally add some people to the group right away. And then just press save. Once you've created that group, you can go back and edit it and give it privileges. So just for example, I'll take this guy. See, he's got a set of privileges, and now we can hit plus to find the privilege list, and then could pick a few more privileges to add. Now, you don't have to worry about keeping the old ones selected on this list. You just need to click and select the ones that you want to add to them and then save. So that's pretty straightforward there. And then once you've got them, you can add people to the group, or you can actually edit the users and add the user to a group there. Depends on what you want to do. If you've got a bunch of groups and you want to add a bunch of groups to one user, it's easier to do it from the users page. If you have a bunch of users and a few groups, sometimes it's easier to edit the group and add the users that way. But it's really a matter of preference. Whichever situation is best, you can do whichever one you want. And groups are good for things like this XAuth, IPsec XAuth dial-in. It's just a little permission, or like this captive portal users. The permissions that a lot of users will need, but you don't want to have to hunt that down in the list every time. So you make a group, add the privilege to the group, and then as you add more people who need that access, just add that group to their memberships. And user management is just over here. It's under System and User Manager again, but here on the Users tab. Now, the only thing you have to fill in is the username and password and the confirm password. The other items are all optional. And as with groups, you can't add the permissions right away. You have to save and then go back and edit. You can choose to disable the account right away, or when you're editing, you can also disable the account. Or you can set an expiration date, and on that day, their account will be expired and disabled. So, say if you set this date for tomorrow, for example, midnight tonight, the account would be disabled. So the date that you put in here is the day the day the access will be stopped. It's not like at the end of the day; it's at the start of the day. And if somebody's account did expire and you need to go back and enable them again, you need to make sure both to clear out or reset a future expiration date and uncheck disable. If you just uncheck disable and you don't fix the date, when you save, it'll be expired immediately again. And obviously that's not what you want. As you can see here, you can add them to groups right away. You can just select a couple, add them over. You also can create them a certificate. And when you're creating a user, the certificate control here is a little bit different. You just have to enter a descriptive name, which is usually their username again. You pick the certificate authority, you pick the key length, and put in the lifetime. If you need more flexible options, if you go back and do this again after the user has been saved, gives you a bit different view that's a lot more flexible. Authorized keys are for SSH access for key-based authentication, which we'll cover later. And IPsec pre-shared key, this is only for pre-shared key-based mobile IPsec access. For the current versions of IPsec remote access that we recommend, like XAuth or IKV2 or EPTLS, that kind of stuff, you do not use the pre-shared key field here. And then if we go back and look at one of these other users here, see this guy, he's not a member of any groups. These permissions were added right to his account. And you can add privileges just like with the groups, just from a different view here. Just editing this, when you added the permission to a user, it's only added to this user. And it's pretty straightforward. And so we've been sort of doing a demonstration as we went here, but let me show you a few things. As you can see, I've got a few users here. I've got Alice Adminia. She has full admin access and IPsec access. Pat Plebis is in the Plebes group. Larry Laccaroni is in the Lackeys group. Norm, no access. He's got IPsec, but nothing else. Studio is in the SSH users group. Carrie, as Carrie Captiport, is in the Captive Portal users group. Nick, no group. He's got no privileges on his account, but no group. And Opal, OpenVPN status. If you look, she only has access to the OpenVPN status, and that's it. So if I log out and just take, for example, the Opal user and log in, I don't have any OpenVPNs on here, but you see when she logged in, it went straight to the OpenVPN status. And if we look at, say, Carrie Captive Portal user, she goes right to the Captive Portal, or the user password management page, so she can change her own password. And if you look under the user the menus here, all she has is Logout and User Manager, which takes her right back to this password page. And the other menus, as I hover, they are all empty. Nothing to do there. So she can change her own password, and that permission is really handy for people like Captive Portal users, where you may give them a default password and they can reset their own, or you might encourage them to keep a secure password, one that you don't know, because the last thing I want to know is a user's password. So if they can set their own, that's the best thing. So give them a default random password, and then let them go in and change their own password. Now, if I log out of here and go into, like, say, this Nick user, he did have dashboard access, and so that one's okay. Now, if I log out of you and go into, say, Larry, he also has dashboard access. But you can see here, just looking at some of the menus, he's got a very limited set of things he can reach. And Sue didn't have access to any GUI pages, so as you see, no page assigned to this user, click here to log out. So if you try to log in and you get this, it means that there are no privileges that were found for the user that were for the GUI. So I'll log back in as Alice. One of these users had deny config right, and I just need to find out which one it was. It was Nick. So if we go to log out, we go back in here as Nick. If we look under aliases, you can see there's an alias that says delete me. But when Nick tries to delete it, it looks like it's going to do it, but boom, didn't actually do anything because he does not have write privileges. And if we look in the system log, it doesn't log that particular action, but you can see how just to show you how some of these other things looked as I was logging in and logging out. You can see the logins from Alice and Opal and everybody else. And the ones that needed redirected, it actually logged the user, where they came from, and what they attempted to access, and where it redirected them to. So if somebody tries to get to a page they shouldn't, you'll find a log entry like that. All right, so I'm practicing what I'm preaching here, and I'm logging in as a regular user, not the plain admin user. moving along. Okay, now SSH Access, you can turn on here under System and User Manager, or sorry, System and Advanced, here on the Admin Access tab. And you have Enable Secure Shell. It's off by default, so all you got to do to turn it on is check that box. And you can, if you check this box here, it disables password logins and goes with key-based auth only. I'll get to that in a minute, but that's something, it's a good thing to have, but at the moment I want to show it both ways. And SSH port, you can move it to another port if you want, leave it blank for the default 22. So let me save that one. So there's 3 different levels of SSH access that you can grant to people. The first is SSH tunneling access, and the privilege is called user-system-SSH tunneling. If a user has that privilege, they can connect to the SSH port with their credentials, and they can actually do SSH port forwarding, so sort of like a VPN of sorts, but they cannot get to the shell and they cannot copy files. Now, if a user has the user-system-copy files privilege, then they can connect with an SCP client like FileZilla, the command line SCP, WinSCP, and so on to transfer files. So you still have to be wary of file permissions, and on NanoBSD, you have to be wary of the read-write status of the file system. And the last one here, the user-system-shell account access, if they've got that, then they can do the other actions as well. They can copy files or do SSH tunneling. And additionally, they get a shell prompt when they log in over SSH. So if we go like down here to this one, if I sudo at, and see I'm just in a SU. It shows me in a SU, and it went straight to a shell prompt. It didn't give me the menu. Now, the passwords for all of these users are set in the GUI only. Don't try to use the password command in the shell. If you do, it might change it temporarily, but the moment the configuration writes out the users again, all of that will be overwritten. So if they need to change the password, they have to do it in the GUI. You can give them the user management privilege if you, or the user password manager page privilege if they want to do that. The admin account and root account share credentials. So if you set your admin password in the GUI, that user will be able to log in as admin or root with that same password. The admin account is locked to the menu for the shell at the account level, and so it cannot use SCP because the menu gets sent to the client, which confuses SCP. So that one's only good for SSH, but the root user can work for SCP or SSH access. Now, other users may access the shell or SCP depending on privileges, like we just mentioned. Now, and if you do SCP files, if you're trying to copy something to the firewall, you need to make sure that the user can actually write to the disk. If it's a full install, there's no worries, but on NanoBSD, the file system is kept read-only. So in those cases, you might actually have to go to either Diagnostics NanoBSD and issue the command to move to read-write status, or you may need to give them access to the shell command to change the read-write status with sudo or something similar. And as I mentioned earlier, when the other users they log in over SSH, they don't get the menu because they just don't have privileges to run those commands. And you can use the Sudo package to grant them access to other commands. I'll go over how to use the Sudo package here in a moment. It's really handy. And another security warning, just like I mentioned before, just because I can't run a command doesn't mean they can't see sensitive files. So just keep in mind that you're working with a firewall, not a multi-user shell server. So don't treat it like it's just another Unix box. Don't just hand out shells to people, willy-nilly. Make sure you only give access to trusted administrators. Now, letting people in with SSH, there are 3 different authentication modes. The first 2 are roughly equivalent. The password method and keyboard interactive. They're both not very secure. Keyboard interactive is just a little bit more secure and extensible than password, but they're both still password based, so they're really not that great. The best thing to do is key-based authentication, where the client generates a public and private key, and then you put the public key on the server, and then you can authenticate that way. It's nigh impossible to brute force, and it's really a lot stronger way to work. So all the password-based modes are susceptible to brute force attacks. So if you have your SSH port open to the world, which you shouldn't, and you have password authentication on, you're going to get brute force attacks, and you really don't want those, because you may have a secure password yourself, but you can't necessarily guarantee that all of your users are all going to have secure passwords or ones that haven't been compromised in some way. So when you're doing key-based authentication, the client generates their own public and private key pair there's like SSH keygen on Unix, there's puttygen on Windows or other systems that have putty. It varies from operating system to operating system, so check your SSH client, see what you have to do. I know like Secure CRT has a built-in key generator. There's just about anything that does SSH is going to have a key generator. The public key is going to usually ends up in a file that ends in .pub. You take the contents of that, you put it into the authorized keys list for the user's account here on the firewall. You can generate a private key without a passphrase, but that's pretty dangerous. Though some automated tasks kind of necessitate that, we frown upon that. You really need to have a passphrase on there. That way, if the user's key gets compromised, they'd still have to compromise not just the key, but they'd also have to know the passphrase to the key. And SSH agent forwarding makes everything a little bit more convenient. And I'll show you an example of that in a bit too. All right, so here's where the fun starts. With the Sudo package, just go to System and Packages, find it in the list to install it. And when you go, it just shows up here under System and Sudo, and it rhymes with voodoo. I know in my brain, even me, if I'm not consciously thinking, I read it as sudo, but it's not sudo, it's sudo. So you just need to, it's one of those things you read it all the time, so your brain thinks about it a certain way, but need to train yourself to say sudo. When you first install the package, these first 3 permissions are there by default. The root user can run any command in sudo, the admin user can run any command in sudo, and anybody in the admin's group can run any command with sudo. So those are the default permissions. If you don't like those, don't want those, you can always remove them. I've kept those here, and I also added that my SSH users group can also run any command. And this our user Nick here, he only has access to pfCTL. So the user group is the person who is receiving the privilege. Run as is who they can run the command as, which 99 times out of 100 is going to be root, but you could also say that they could run a command as another user or a particular group. The no password box here controls whether or not they need to enter a password. Generally, it's best to keep that unchecked, but in certain cases, if there's a command is okay, and for a specific user, you can check that box, and then they can run that particular command or any commands without a password. So yes, as I mentioned here, convenient, but potentially dangerous. Now this command list over here, you can see I've used the special all keyword that means any command for most of these. But if you put a command in there without parameters, just like I've done here, then the user could put any permissions they want, or parameters they want after that. If you put a command with a specific parameter, then they can only run it with that specific parameter and no others. And if you put 2 double quotes after the command, that means they can only run the command without any parameters whatsoever. And you can specify multiple commands here using a comma-separated list. And anytime somebody runs a command, it is logged to the main system log. So like Sue had access. If I do sudo ifconfig, type of password, it runs. If we go over here to the system log, you'll see here that it logged the fact that she ran that. If I log in as Nick instead, you can see here, if I do if I try to run a command he doesn't have access to, it logs an error to the user, and also in the system log, says command not allowed, so on and so forth. But he did have access to run pfctl, like to show states. See, he doesn't have access to run it directly, but if we run it with sudo, bam, no password, showed it right away. And you can see another quick little example here. If I do sudo src.initial, if I run this through sudo, then Sue can get the console menu if there's something there you need to do. And so you can see here we connected through with that and got through. Let's see, working with admin and root works just like coming in with Sue, except you get the menu. So if we do admin, so we went straight into the GUI there. And then if we try FileZilla here, there you can see we got access. We can go in and we can copy files back and forth if we had to. And we already showed you the unprivileged user and how to use sudo. And what we can do here is a quick little SSH key demo. So if we do SSH keygen, it's going to ask where I want to save the key, or just press enter because I don't really care this time. This is going to be for Sue, so I'm going to put in a passphrase for Sue. Oh, I didn't. You didn't make it long enough. There we go. And you can see it says it placed our public key in this file. So if we get the contents of that file, and copy, come over here into the user manager, find Sue, go into authorized keys and paste that guy in, save. Now, if we do SSH as Sue, you'll notice that it, instead of prompting for the password, it says enter passphrase for the key. And now we're in. And if we look here in the system log, accepted public key for Sue rather than keyboard interactive. And so that's Sue in with a key. And it was really just that simple. It is more complicated than setting a password because the user has to do something on their end. And it's not quite as portable because the user couldn't just SSH from any old machine, but it is a lot more secure. Somebody could potentially go through and set that, on a different basis. They could, use something, a portable SSH type thing, have it on a thumb drive. If it's encrypted, it may not be a bad thing, but it's still usually better to have a different key for each system you want to come from, if possible. And if you notice here, there's another thing we can do called SSH agent, which runs a little daemon for the SSH agent. And this right here, what it does, when you run SSH agent, it tries to run it as a daemon and it outputs an environment variable setting that tells the other things where to find the agent. So if you notice these little here, they're not single quotes, they are backticks. So eval SSH agent and then SSH add. SSH add will find your keys and prompt you for the password for them to cache them in memory using the agent. And then we did that. Now, sorry, did that on the wrong one. If we do this back here on our workstation, not the server, sorry. Prompt for the passphrase for the key. And now if I try to SSH to Sue, bam, I didn't need to manually put in the password because the key had been cached by the agent. And that will chain too. So I mean, if you have the same key structure along the line between one server and another, you could SSH to one from one to another, and then if that also supports your agent, it will follow you along. So as long as you have your key authenticated locally, you can get to other systems along the line. You could SSH from this one to another one that had the same key and get in there as well, and your agent would have forwarded your access along. Okay, so moving away from that, talking about setting up remote access to your GUI. Things you need to be worried about, or things you should worry about, but some people don't. When you're setting up remote GUI access, it is absolutely unforgivable to have HTTP running on your WAN. So if the GUI is running HTTP and you've got that exposed on the WAN, it's just outright bad. Your credentials are being transmitted in the clear. Somebody could sniff that, and your connections are encrypted. Anything you transfer back and forth, say you took a configuration backup, all your certificates, keys, everything for your VPNs, all that would be transmitted in plain text over the internet, which is just horrible. So never, ever, 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 ever do that. As tempting as it might be, never do that. And even worse than that is if you've got your GUI port open to the world on any port using HTTP or HTTPS, scanners are going to find it and hit it. Moving it to an alternate port, it's a security by obscurity. It's really not helping you a whole lot. Something eventually is going to find that. It's better, like I labeled here, good. If you only have it open to select hosts. An admin could, if an admin's on a dynamic IP, they can have a DNS host name. You can track that with an alias. There's really no reason not to do that. And it would only allow select people into your GUI, which is a good thing. Even better on that is to have it on a non-standard port, only open to certain hosts. But the best, obviously, is to not have your GUI exposed to the world at all, and they can only get in by VPN. Obviously, much less convenient, but it is a lot more secure. All right, so for remote SSH access, it's sort of along the same lines, except SSH is always going to be encrypted, but you still don't want to leave it open to the world because there's going to be a constant barrage of brute force attacks, and really you just do not want that either. You don't want to invite the trouble. Kind of meh on the list is SSH open to the world on an alternate port. Again, like with the GUI, scanners are still going to find you. It may take them a little longer, but they're going to find you. So you might skirt some casual scans, but not a determined attacker. It's okay for SSH open to select hosts. It's good to have SSH with key-based authentication. It's better to have key-based auth only open to select hosts, and the best would be no direct access, key-based auth in a VPN, or just a VPN with password auth would be all right. But it's sort of in between there. Obviously, the more secure you can make it, the better. But obviously, less convenient. So you've got that trade-off again. So a few extra best practices here. You should only ever use encrypted protocols to manage. So HTTPS and SSH, never HTTP. Reduce or eliminate use of the admin account. Never leave the system password at the default value. So even if you're going to disable the admin account, change the password to something long and random before you disable it. Everybody should have their own account, so no sharing, no group accounts, no general purpose accounts, no ops account or anything like that. Every admin has their own separate account with their own name, their own password. So I have encouraged use of strong passwords. We don't have a way to enforce that currently. We might grow that eventually. But longer than 8 characters, mix of letters, numbers, symbols, and case switches. Password should be changed frequently, so at most 90 days, and not repeat. Again, we don't have a way to enforce that, but it might be down the road. I think like some specs like PCI say you have to be less than 90 days and do not repeat the last 4 or 5 passwords. So those are all things to be on the lookout for. Is set an expiration date or disable accounts that only need temporary access, things like vendors, somebody or a consultant that may need to come in and look at it. Or if you're one of our customers and we're in your firewall looking at things, as soon as we're done, disable that account or set an expiration date so we can't get into it after, like the next day or two. If you fire somebody or somebody quits or your association with them is terminated or otherwise gone, remove their account ASAP. The last thing you'd want is for somebody who left to hold a grudge and log into your firewall and sabotage. So yeah, as soon as somebody is gone, kill their accounts immediately. Don't expose your GUI or SSH services to the world, as I mentioned. So just don't do that, as tempting as it is. Use key-based authentication for SSH. Use remote access VPNs for management wherever possible. And don't ignore the physical security side of things. You can disable the console, but a determined user with physical access could actually still get in and reset that password if they want. There would be some disruption, obviously, but on our lockout page in the wiki and in the book, we have instructions on how to bypass that. So if that's a concern, you need to physically control access as well. Lock it in a mini cage or in a rack, somewhere the user can't even physically get access to the unit. And you can set up external authentication servers. The LDAP servers can be used for access to the GUI. If you have an LDAP group that matches a local group that's defined, you can pass permissions back that way. So you define the permissions locally on a group on the firewall, and then when they log in with LDAP, it finds that group and finds the matching group in pfSense, and then they get those permissions. But if LDAP is down, it falls back to local auth, but it's really slow loading pages. Like it takes minutes to load a page. But you can reset that at the console if there's a way to reset that from the console if you have to. But that's something I'll touch on in a future one if we go into LDAP. Radius can't yet be used for GUI access because we don't have a way to pass back groups from Radius. But that's something we've got some ideas on how to fix in the future. Either LDAP or Radius can be used for OpenVPN or IPsec, the ones defined under System and User Manager. And then some areas like Capture Portal or L2TP, they're not connected to the authentication servers, but they have their own Radius settings that you can use. A few other notes. The XML RPC sync that I mentioned earlier, where it gets used with a high availability cluster, like in a CARP type setup, that does require the use of the admin user, so you can't disable that. But that's something we're going to address in a future version. There's a box there to set the user, but it doesn't actually work with anything other than admin, so it's a little misleading at the moment. If you reset the LAN IP at the console, it will reset the authentication source back to local. So if you set it to LDAP and LDAP's broken, you can reset it back to local that way. The password reset function on the console will also re-enable an admin account if it's used. So at the console, if you hit the button to reset the password of the admin account, it will turn it back on and reset the password. And we have a command line script to change passwords as well. You can use that straight from the command prompt. pf capital SSH.php playback change password and then the username. It prompts for the password and a confirmed password, and also will re-enable or remove expiration from an account if you want. So that's the end of the main presentation, but I did actually manage to save the questions people had the last time. The first one was, let me move this over here. How can we avoid man-in-the-middle for GUI access? And the best way to do that is to actually get a real trusted certificate from a certificate authority and place it on the firewall. To some extent, you can get, you can just install your own CA and certificates into your browser and then just be on the lookout for changes. But but if you get the warning from your browser every time you log into the firewall, you're probably never going to notice if that certificate changes. So the key is making sure you don't get a certificate warning when you go to the GUI, whether that's with a real trusted certificate or a trust chain you set up yourself. That's up to you. it's probably easier to get a certificate from a real certificate authority, but that may also have a cost to it, unless you've already got a wildcard certificate or something on your domain. Somebody else had asked about using two-factor auth, such as certificates or SMS, PAM type things for the GUI. We don't have anything like that for the GUI currently. For VPNs that do like Radius, you can kind of hook into some of those things there, but that's really up to your Radius server and the other two-factor auth mechanisms that way. But that's something we're looking at eventually, but it's just not there for GUI access just yet. Somebody asked if the deny config right was page specific or global, and it is global. When you put it on a user, then they can't write to any page. We're not likely to make a page specific deny config right in the future, because that would more than double the list of permissions that we have, and it would make things really confusing to work with. So it's not likely to work. You could have, they could have two different accounts, one with deny config right that can see a lot of things, and then one without deny config right that only has access to the pages they really need to change. Let's see here. Somebody was asking about a user to set up other VPN users, but not general admin access. There's no real good way to do that, because if a user can get to the user management page, they could grant themselves admin privileges and do other things. However, if you have the VPN set for certificate only, you could give them access just to certificate management, but not user management, which is a little bit more secure. But if you have them using, say, Radius authentication, then you could do the internally managed certs with external auth, and maybe they could get to the free Radius package or something like that. Somebody asked if SSH brute force prevention is enabled by default. Yes, it is, and so is the GUI brute force prevention. If somebody tries to log in, I think it's 15 times in an hour, or maybe it's 15 times in 15 minutes. I'd have to look up the specifics again. But if they try to log in too many times in a short period of time, they'll land in the lockout table for at least an hour, and then they get cleaned up. There was a problem with the cleanup process on 2.15, but that's fixed up on 2.2. So on 2.15 and before, they were never expired from the lockout table. So it was a little trickier there. But yeah, it's on by default, and I don't think there's a way to actually disable that, at least for SSH. For the GUI, if there's an option to disable the logging of the user logins, and when that is disabled, I believe by consequence it can't track the failed logins either. So that's something to be on the lookout for. But that's it. So and those were all the questions we had. So that's it for this month, for the February Hangout. The March Hangout is probably going to be the last Friday of the month, and the topic is going to be, I think we've already chosen the topic. Let me look at what we picked here. It is going to be bandwidth monitoring. So we'll go over how to monitor bandwidth on the firewall using the built-in mechanisms and some packages. So, all right, we'll see you back here later this month, and the access info will be available just a few days prior to the Hangout. So we'll see you there. Have a good day.